And we're live! Hi, guys! Oh my goodness. Yay! Hi. Happy Cinco de Mayo! Did we have tacos? I had tacos. I know Angie had tacos. Angie told me she had tacos. Tacos and coffee. They go together, right? Tacos, coffee, and Harry Potter. It's an amazing Cinco de Mayo. Alrighty then. Where were we? Boo. What are you booing for? Oh, and beer. Yeah, beer goes with... Do I need whiskey tonight, guys? Ew. No, I don't like tequila. You know that song, Tequila Makes Your Clothes Fall Off? No, tequila makes me feel sick. I think I drank too much Jose Cuervo one time at a party. Ooh, actually, I know I did. That was the night I woke up inside a dryer. I will consume some whiskey with everybody, though. How's that? I need to empty this bottle so I can cut the bottom off of it and turn it into a light. Okay. Oh, okay. I'm just making sure there, Tom. I was going to say, I'm going to get very upset. Okay. I don't need any whiskey yet, do I? I'm just going to sip it. Coat the throat. Get myself ready and prepared. I don't know what accents I'm going to come up with tonight. Stan, our conductor, was like some weird form of like Irish, not sure what. That just came out of my mouth last time. I'm sorry. Whiskey does sometimes make my clothes fall off. Yes, it does. There's quite a few people that can attest to that. Oh my goodness! Guess what, guys? This could not have been more perfectly planned. It's Cinco de Mayo. It's the 5th of May, and we are starting with Chapter 5. All of the fives. 5, 5, 5. Let's do this. It's not 2025, though. Why would I want to bring Michelle Rose on camera? Michelle, would you like me to bring you on camera? Or Chris Downing, would you like me to bring you on camera? I didn't know that was an option. It just keeps popping up. All right. We are going to start with the Dementors. I don't know if anybody knows, but there is a reason why the title of this chapter is put on a bar of chocolate, and we are soon to find out. We have 7 viewers. I hope all of you stay and enjoy Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban at Chapter 5. We have a lot of fun reading. Oh, nope. See, I lost a viewer already. You guys are... Oh, they're back. All right, let's start this. Ah, yes, Harry is staying at the Leaky Cauldron. Yes, Angie can attest to that. No, you're not, you pain in the butt. At Angie's house, we have 4 viewers. All right. Tom woke Harry next morning with his usual toothless grin and a cup of tea. Harry got dressed and was just persuading a disgruntled Hedwig to get back into her cage when Ron banged his way into the room, pulling his sweatshirt over his head and looking irritable. "The sooner we get on the train, the better," he said. "At least I can get away from Percy at Hogwarts. Now he's accusing me of dripping tea on his photo of Penelope Clearwater. You know," Ron grimaced, "his girlfriend. She's hidden her face under the frame because her nose has gone all blotchy." Awesome, Michelle. I approve. I'm wearing my Harry Potter pants. Is today Max's birthday? Max the Fat Cat's birthday? Happy birthday, Max. Don't go scratching anybody else's face. It's rude. This will look real funny to all my YouTube viewers later on. It's like I'm talking to myself. They can pretend I'm talking to them. Don't worry. I'm talking to you. You have all of my attention, I promise. That was creepy. All right. I've got something to tell you, Harry began, but they were interrupted by Fred and George, who had looked in to congratulate Ron on infuriating Percy again. They headed down to breakfast, where Mr. Weasley was reading the front page of the Daily Prophet with a furrowed brow, and Mrs. Weasley was telling Hermione and Ginny about a love potion she'd made as a young girl. All three of them were rather giggly. "What were you saying?" Ron asked Harry as they sat down. "Later," Harry muttered, as Percy stormed in. Harry had no chance to speak to Ron or Hermione in the chaos of leaving. They were too busy heaving all their trunks down the Leaky Cauldron's narrow staircase and piling them up near the door, with Hedwig and Hermes, Percy's screech owl, perched on top in their cages. A small wickerwork basket stood beside the heap of trunks, spitting loudly. "It's all right, Crookshanks," Hermione cooed through the wickerwork. "I'll let you out on the train." "You won't!" snapped Ron. "What about poor Scabbers, eh?" He pointed at his chest where a large lump indicated that Scabbers was curled up in his pocket. Mr. Weasley, who had been outside waiting for the ministry cars, stuck his head inside. "They're here," he said. "Harry, come on." Mr. Weasley marched Harry across the street, the short stretch of pavement, towards the first of two old-fashioned dark green cars, each of which were driven by a furtive-looking wizard wearing a suit of emerald velvet. Ugh, velvet suits. "In you get, Harry," said Mr. Weasley, glancing up and down the crowded street. Harry got into the back of the car, which was shortly joined by Hermione, Ron, and, to Ron's disgust, Percy. The journey to King's Cross was very uneventful compared to Harry's trip on the night bus. The ministry cars seemed almost ordinary, though Harry noticed that they could slide through gaps that Uncle Vernon's new company car certainly couldn't have managed. They reached King's Cross with 20 minutes to spare. The ministry drivers found them trolleys, unloaded their trunks, touched their hats to Mr. Weasley, and drove away, somehow managing to jump to the head of an unmoving queue for the traffic lights. That would be very convenient. Mr. Weasley kept close to Harry's elbow all the way into the station. "Right then," he said, glancing around at them. "Let's do this in pairs, as there are so many of us. I'll go first with Harry." Mr. Weasley strolled towards the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, pushing Harry's trolley and apparently very interested in the inner-city 125 that had arrived on platform 9. With a meaningful look at Harry, he leant casually against the barrier. Harry intimidated him. The next moment they had fallen sideways through the solid metal into platform 9 3/4, and looked up to see the Hogwarts Express, a scarlet steam engine, puffing smoke over the platform, packed with witches and wizards seeing their children onto the train. "'Tis hot." Percy and Ginny suddenly appeared behind Harry. They were panting, and had apparently taken the barrier at a run. "Ah, there's Penelope," said Percy, smoothing his hair and going pink again. Ginny caught Harry's eye, and they both turned away to hide their laughter as Percy strode over to a girl with long curly hair, walking with his chest thrown out so that she couldn't miss his shiny badge. Once the remaining Weasleys and Hermione had joined them, Harry and Mr. Weasley led the way to the end of the train, past packed compartments, to a carriage that looked quite empty. They loaded the trunks onto it, stowed Hedwig and Crookshanks in the luggage rack, and then went outside to say goodbye to Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. Mrs. Weasley kissed all her children, and then Hermione, and finally Harry. He was embarrassed, but quite pleased when she gave him an extra hug. "Do take care, won't you, Harry?" she said as she straightened up, her eyes oddly bright. And then she opened her enormous handbag and said, "I've made you all sandwiches. Here you are. Ron? No, they're not corned beef. Fred? Where's Fred? Here you are, dear." "Harry," said Mr. Weasley quietly, "come here for a moment." He jerked his head towards a pillar. Harry followed him behind it, leaving the others crowded around Mrs. Weasley. "There's something I've got to tell you before you leave." It's all right, Mr. Weasley, said Harry. I already know. You know? How could you know? I heard you and Mrs. Weasley talking last night. I couldn't help hearing, Harry added quickly. Sorry. That's not the way I'd have chosen for you to find out, said Mr. Weasley, looking anxious. No, honestly, it's okay. This way you won't have broken your word to Fudge, and I know what's going on. Harry, you must be very scared. I'm not, said Harry sincerely. Really? He added, because Mr. Weasley was looking disbelieving. I'm not trying to be a hero, but seriously, Sirius Black can't be worse than Voldemort, can he? Mr. Weasley flinched at the sound of the name, but overlooked it. Harry, I knew you were, well, made of stronger stuff than Fudge seems to think, but I'm obviously pleased that you're not scared, but... Arthur! Called Mrs. Weasley, who was now shepherding the rest onto the train. Arthur, what are you doing? It's about to go! He's coming, Molly, said Mr. Weasley, as he turned back to Harry and kept talking in a lower, more hurried voice. Listen, I want to give you my word. I want you to give me your word that I'll be a good boy and stay in the castle, said Harry gloomily. Not entirely, said Mr. Weasley, who looked more serious than Harry had ever seen him. Harry, swear to me that you won't go looking for Black. Harry stared. What? There was a loud whistle. Guards were walking along the train, slamming all the doors shut. Promise me, Harry, said Mr. Weasley, talking more quietly still, that whatever happens... Why would I go looking for someone I know wants to kill me, said Harry blankly. Swear to me that whatever you might hear... Arthur, quickly! Called Mrs. Weasley. Steam was billowing from the train. It had started to move. Harry ran to the compartment door and Ron threw it open and stood back to let him in. They leaned out the window and waved at Mr. and Mrs. Weasley until the train turned a corner and blocked them from view. I need to talk to you in private, Harry muttered to Ron and Hermione as the train picked up speed. Go away, Ginny, said Ron. Oh, that's nice, said Ginny huffily, and she stalked off. Harry, Ron, and Hermione set off down the corridor looking for an empty compartment, but all were full except for the one at the very end of the train. This only had one occupant, a man sitting fast asleep next to the window. Harry, Ron, and Hermione checked on the threshold. The Hogwarts Express was usually reserved for students, and they had never seen an adult there before, except for the witch who pushed the food trolley. The stranger was wearing an extremely shabby set of wizard's robes, which had been darned in several places. He looked ill and exhausted. Though he seemed quite young, his light brown hair was flecked with gray. Who do you reckon he is? Ron hissed as they sat down and slid the door shut, taking the seats furthest away from the window. Professor R.J. Lupin, whispered Hermione at once. How do you know that? It's on his case, replied Hermione, pointing at the luggage rack over the man's head, where there was a small, battered case held together by a large quantity of neatly knotted string. The name Professor R.J. Lupin was stamped across one corner in peeling letters. Wonder what he teaches, said Ron, frowning at Professor Lupin's pallid profile. That's obvious, whispered Hermione. There's only one vacancy, isn't there? Defense against the dark arts. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had already had 2 Defense Against the Dark Arts teachers, both of whom had only lasted 1 year. There were rumors that the job was jinxed. Well, I hope he's up to it, said Ron doubtfully. He looks like one good hex would finish him off, doesn't he? Anyway, he said, turning to Harry, what are you going to tell us? Harry explained all about Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's argument and the warning Mr. Weasley had given him. When he'd finished, Ron looked thunderstruck, and Hermione had her hand over her mouth. She finally lowered him and said, Sirius Black escaped to come after you? Oh, Harry, you have to be really, really careful. Don't go looking for trouble, Harry. I don't go looking for trouble, said Harry, nettled. Trouble usually finds me. How thick would Harry have to be to go looking for a nutter who wants to kill him, said Ron shakily. They were taking the news worse than Harry had expected. Both Ron and Hermione seemed to be much more frightened of Black than he was. No one knows how he got out of Azkaban, said Ron uncomfortably. No one's ever done it before. And he was in a top security prison, too. But they'll catch him, won't they? Said Hermione earnestly. I mean, they've got all the muggles out looking for him, too. What's that noise? Said Ron suddenly. A faint, tiny sort of whistle was coming from somewhere. They looked all around the compartment. It's coming from the train, Harry, said Ron, standing up and reaching for the luggage rack. A moment later, he had pulled the pocket sneakoscope out from between Harry's robes. It was spinning very fast in the palm of Ron's hands and glowing brilliantly. Is that a sneakoscope? Said Hermione, interested, standing up for a better look. Yeah, mind you, it's a very cheap one, Ron said. It went haywire just as I was tying it to Errol's leg to send to Harry. Were you doing anything untrustworthy at the time? Said Hermione shrewdly. No. Well, I wasn't supposed to be using Errol. You know, he's not really up for long journeys, but how else was I supposed to get Harry's present to him? Stick it back in the trunk, Harry advised, as the sneakoscope whistled piercingly, or it'll wake him up. He nodded towards Professor Lupin. Ron stuffed the sneakoscope into a particularly horrible pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks, which deadened the sound, and then closed the lid of the trunk on it. We could get it checked at Hogsmeade, said Ron, sitting back down. They sell that sort of thing in Dervish and Bang's, magical instruments and stuff. Fred and George told me. Do you know much about Hogsmeade? Said Hermione keenly. I've read it's the only entirely non-Muggle settlement in Britain. Yeah, I think it is, said Ron in an offhand sort of way. But that's not why I want to go. I just want to get into Honeydukes. What's that? Said Hermione. It's this sweet shop, said Ron in a dreamy look coming over his face, where they've got everything. Pepper imps, they make smoke in your mouth, and great fat choco balls full of strawberry mousse and clotted cream, and really excellent sugar quills which you can suck in class and just look like you're thinking what to write next. But Hogsmeade's a very interesting place, isn't it? Hermione pressed on eagerly. In Sites of Historical Sorcery, it says the inn was the headquarters for the 1612 Goblin Rebellion. And the Shrieking Shack's supposed to be the most severely haunted building in Britain. And massive sherbet balls that make you levitate a few inches off the ground while you're sucking them, said Ron, who was plainly not listening to a word Hermione was saying. Hermione looked around at Harry. Won't it be nice to get out of school for a bit and explore Hogsmeade? Expect it will, said Harry heavily. You'll have to tell me what you found out. What do you mean? Said Ron. I can't go. The Dursleys didn't sign my permission form, and Fudge wouldn't either. Ron looked horrified. You're not allowed to come? But no way, McGonagall. Someone will give you permission. Harry gave a hollow laugh. Professor McGonagall, head of Gryffindor House, was very strict. Or we could ask Fred and George. They know every secret passage out of the castle. Ron, said Hermione sharply, I don't think Harry should be sneaking out of the school with Black on the loose. Yep, I expect that's what McGonagall's going to say when I ask for permission, said Harry bitterly. But if we're with him, said Ron spiritedly to Hermione, Black wouldn't dare. Oh, Ron, don't talk rubbish, snapped Hermione. Black's already murdered a bunch of people in the middle of a crowded street. Do you really think he's going to worry about attacking Harry just because we're there? She was fumbling with the straps of Crookshank's basket as she spoke. Don't let that thing out, Ron said, but too late. Crookshanks leapt lightly from the basket, stretched, yawned, and sprung onto Ron's knee. The lump in Ron's pocket trembled and shook, and he shoved Crookshanks angrily away. Get out of it! Ron, don't! Said Hermione angrily. Ron was about to answer back when Professor Lupin stirred. They watched him apprehensively, but he simply turned his head the other way, mouth slightly open, and slept on. The Hogwarts Express moved steadily north, and the scenery outside the windows became wilder and darker, while the clouds overhead thickened. People were chasing backwards and forwards past the door of their compartment. Crookshanks had now settled in an empty seat, his squashed face turned towards Ron, his yellow eyes on Ron's top pocket. At 1 o'clock, the plump witch with the food trolley arrived at the compartment door. "Do you think we should wake him up?" Ron asked awkwardly, nodding towards Professor Lupin. "He looks like he could do with some food." Hermione approached Professor Lupin cautiously. Professor," she said. "Excuse me, Professor!" He didn't move. "Don't worry, dear," said the witch as she handed Harry a large stack of cauldron cakes. "If he's hungry when he wakes up, I'll be in the front with the driver." "I suppose he is asleep?" said Ron quietly as the witch slid the compartment door closed. "I mean, he hasn't died, has he?" No, he's breathing," whispered Hermione, taking the cauldron cake Harry passed her. Cake sounds good. He might not be very good company, but Professor Lupin's presence in their compartment had its uses. Mid-afternoon, just as it had started to rain, blurring the rolling hills outside the window, they heard footsteps in the corridor again, and their least favorite 3 people arrived in the door. Draco Malfoy, flanked by his cronies, Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle. Well, now we know their first names. Draco Malfoy and Harry had been enemies ever since they had met on their first train ride to Hogwarts. Malfoy, who had a pale, pointed, sneering face, was in Slytherin House. He played Seeker on the Slytherin Gryffindor team, and the same position that Harry played on the Gryffindor team. Crabbe and Goyle seemed to exist to do Malfoy's bidding. They were both wide and muscly. Crabbe was taller, with a pudding basin haircut and a very thick neck. Goyle had short, bristly hair and long gorilla arms. "Well, look who it is," said Malfoy in his usual lazy drawl, opening the compartment door. "Potty and the Weasel." Crabbe and Goyle chuckled trollishly. "I heard your father finally got his hands on some gold this summer, Weasley," said Malfoy. "Did your mother die of shock?" Ron stood up so quickly he knocked Crookshank's basket to the floor. Professor Lupin gave a snort. "Who's that?" said Malfoy, taking an automatic step backwards as he spotted Lupin. "New teacher," said Harry, who had got to his feet too, in case he needed to hold Ron back. "What were you saying, Malfoy?" Malfoy's pale eyes narrowed. He wasn't fool enough to pick a fight right under the teacher's nose. "Come on," he muddled resentfully to Crabbe and Goyle, and they disappeared. Harry and Ron sat down again, Ron massaging his knuckles. Like, that's real intimidating. "I'm not going to take any rubbish from Malfoy this year," he said angrily. "I mean it. If he makes one more crack about my family, I'm going to get a hold of his head and—" Ron made a violent gesture in midair. "Ron," hissed Hermione, pointing at Professor Lupin. "Be careful." But Professor Lupin was still fast asleep. The rain thickened as the train sped yet further north. The windows were now a solid, shimmering gray, which gradually darkened until the lanterns flickered into life all along the corridors and over the luggage racks. That sounds heavenly. The train rattled, the rain hammered, and the wind roared, but still Professor Lupin slept. "We must be nearly there," said Ron, leaning forward to look past Professor Lupin at the now completely black window. The words had hardly left him when the train started to slow down. "Brilliant," said Ron, getting up and walking carefully past Professor Lupin to try and see outside. "I'm starving. I want to get to the feast." "We can't be there yet," said Hermione, checking her watch. "So why are we stopping?" The train was getting slower and slower. As the noise of the pistons fell away, the wind and the rain sounded louder than ever against the windows. Harry, who was nearest to the door, got up to look into the corridor. Oh. I need somebody to come massage my back for me. Alright, all along the corridor, heads were sticking out curiously from their compartments. The train came to a stop with a jolt, and distant thuds and bangs told them that luggage had fallen out of racks. Then, without warning, all the lamps went out, and they plunged into total darkness. "What's going on?" said Ron's voice from behind Harry. "Ouch!" gasped Hermione. "Ron, that was my foot!" Harry fell back to his seat. "Do you think we've broken down?" "I dunno." There was a squeaking noise, and Harry saw the dim black outline of Ron wiping a patch clean on the window and peering out. "There's something moving out there," said Ron. "I think people are coming on board." The compartment door suddenly opened and someone fell painfully against Harry's legs. "Sorry, don't know what's going on. Ouch, sorry." "Hello, Neville," said Harry, feeling around in the dark and pulling Neville up by his cloak. "Harry, is that you? What's happening?" "No idea. Sit down." There was a loud hissing and a yelp of pain. Neville had tried to sit on Crookshanks. "I'm going to go and ask the driver what's going on," came Hermione's voice. Harry felt her pass him and heard the door slide open again, and then a thud and two loud squeals of pain. "What's that? Who's that? Ginny? Hermione? What are you doing? I was looking for Ron. Come in and sit down." "Not here," said Harry hurriedly. "I'm here." "Ouch," said Neville. "Quiet," said a hoarse voice suddenly. Professor Lupin appeared to have woken up at last. Harry could hear movements in his corner. None of them spoke. There was a soft, crackling noise, and a shivering light filled the compartment. Professor Lupin appeared to be holding a handful of flames. They illuminated his tired, gray face, but his eyes looked alert and weary. "Stay where you are," he said, in the same hoarse voice. "Stay where you are," he said in the same hoarse voice, and he got slowly to his feet with a handful of fire held out in front of him. The door slid slowly open before Lupin could reach it. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the shivering flame in Lupin's hand, was a cloaked figure that towered to the ceiling. Its face was completely hidden beneath its hood. Harry's eyes darted downwards, and what he saw made his stomach contract. There was a hand protruding from the cloak, and it was glistening, grayish, slimy-looking, and scabbed, like something dead that had decayed in water. It was visible only for a split second. As though the creature beneath the cloak sensed Harry's gaze, the hand was suddenly withdrawn back into the folds of the black material. And then the thing beneath the hood, whatever it was, drew a long, slow, rattling breath as though it was trying to suck something more than air from its surroundings. An intense cold swept over them all. Harry felt his own breath catch in his chest. The cold went deeper than his skin. It was inside his chest. It was inside his very heart. Harry's eyes rolled into his head. He couldn't see. He was drowning in cold. There was a rushing in his ears as though of water. He was being dragged downward, the roaring growing louder. And then, from far away, he heard screaming. Terrible, terrified, pleading screams. He wanted to help whoever it was. He tried to move his arms, but couldn't. The thick white fog was swirling around inside him. "Harry! Harry! Are you all right?" Someone was slapping his face. "What?" Harry opened his eyes. There were lanterns above him. The floor was shaking. The Hogwarts Express was moving again, and the lights had come back on. He seemed to have slid out of his seat onto the floor. Ron and Hermione were kneeling next to him, and above them he could see Neville and Professor Lupin watching. Harry felt very sick. When he pulled up his hand to push his glasses off, he felt cold sweat on his face. Ron and Hermione heaved him back onto his seat. "Are you okay?" said Ron nervously. "Yeah," said Harry, looking quickly towards the door. The hooded creature had vanished. "What happened? What was that? Where was that thing? Who screamed?" "No one screamed," said Ron, more nervous still. Harry looked around the bright compartment. Ginny and Neville looked back at him, both very pale. "But I heard screaming." A loud snap made them all jump. Professor Lupin was breaking an enormous slab of chocolate into pieces. "Here," he said to Harry, handing him a particularly large piece. "Eat it. It'll help." I don't know what Lupin should sound like. Harry took the chocolate, but didn't eat it. "What was that thing?" he asked Lupin. "A Dementor," said Lupin, who was now giving chocolate to everyone else. "One of the Dementors of Azkaban." Everyone stared at him. Professor Lupin crumpled up the empty chocolate wrapper. Oh, let's see how well you guys can see this. That's Professor Lupin. That's the creepy hand that we just spoke about. There's Harry. And the Dementor. Professor Lupin crumpled up the empty chocolate wrapper and put it in his pocket. "Eat," he repeated. "It'll help. I need to speak to the driver. Excuse me." He strolled past Harry and disappeared into the corridor. "Are you sure you're okay, Harry?" said Hermione, watching Harry anxiously. "I don't get it. What happened?" said Harry, wiping more sweat off his face. "Well, that thing, the Dementor, stood there looking around. I mean, I think it did. I couldn't see its face. And I thought you were having a fit or something," said Ron, who still looked scared. "You sort of rigid and fell out of your seat and started twitching." "And Professor Lupin stepped over you and walked toward the Dementor and pulled out his wand," said Hermione. "And he said, 'None of us is hiding Sirius Black under our cloaks. Go!' But the Dementor didn't move. So Lupin muttered something, and a silvery thing shot out of his wand at it, and turned around and sort of glided away." "It was horrible," said Neville in a higher voice than usual. "Did you feel how cold it went when it came in?" "I felt weird," said Ron, shifting his shoulders uncomfortably, "like I'd never be cheerful again." Ginny, who was huddled in her corner, looked nearly as bad as Harry felt, and gave a small sob. Hermione went over and put a comforting arm around her. "Did any of you fall off your seats?" said Harry awkwardly. "No," said Ron anxiously at Harry again. "Ginny was shaking like mad, though." Harry didn't understand. He felt weak and shivery, as though he was recovering from a bad bout of flu. He also felt the beginnings of shame. Why had he gone to pieces like that, when no one else had? Professor Lupin had come back. He paused as he entered, looked around, and said with a small smile, "I haven't poisoned the chocolate, you know." Harry took a bite, and to his great surprise, felt warmth spread suddenly to the tips of his fingers and toes. "We'll be at Hogwarts in 10 minutes, said Professor Lupin. "Are you all right, Harry?" Harry didn't ask how Professor Lupin knew his name. "Fine," he muttered, embarrassed. They didn't talk much during the remainder of the journey. At long last, the train stopped at Hogsmeade Station, and there was a great scrambling to get out. Owls hooted, cats meowed, and Neville's pet toad croaked loudly from under his hat. It was freezing on the tiny platform. Rain was driving down in icy sheets. "First years this way," called a familiar voice. Harry, Ron, and Hermione turned and saw the gigantic outline of Hagrid at the end of the platform, beckoning the terrified-looking first-years forward to their traditional journey across the lake. "All right, you three," Hagrid yelled over the heads of the crowd. They waved at him, but had no chance to speak to him because the mass of people around them was shunting them away along the platform. Shunting them away. Harry, Ron, and Hermione followed the rest of the school out onto the rough mud track, where at least 100 stagecoaches awaited the remaining students. Each pulled, Harry could only assume, by an invisible horse, because when they climbed inside and shut the door, the coach set off by itself, bumping and swaying in procession. The coach smelled faintly of mold and straw. Harry felt better since the chocolate, but still weak. Ron and Hermione kept looking at him sideways, as though frightened he might collapse again. As the carriage trundled towards a pair of magnificent wrought-iron gates, flanked with stone columns topped with winged boars. Yes, winged boars, guys, not gargoyles, winged boars. Harry saw two more towering hooded Dementors standing guard on either side. A wave of cold sickness threatened to engulf him again. He leaned back into the lumpy seat and closed his eyes until they had passed through the gates. The carriage picked up speed on the long sloping drive up to the castle. Hermione was leaning out of the tiny window, watching the many turrets and towers draw nearer. At last the carriage swayed to a halt, and Hermione and Ron got out. As Harry stepped down, a drawling, delighted voice sounded in his ear. "You fainted, Potter? Is Longbottom telling the truth? You actually fainted?" Malfoy elbowed past Hermione to block Harry's way up the stone steps to the castle, his face gleeful and his pale eyes glinting maliciously. "Shove off, Malfoy," said Ron, whose jaw was clenched. "Did you faint as well, Weasley?" said Malfoy loudly. "Did the scary old Dementor frighten you too, Weasley?" "Is there a problem?" said a mild voice. Professor Lupin had just got out of the next carriage. Malfoy gave Professor Lupin an insolent stare, which took in the patches on his robes and the dilapidated suitcase. With a tiny hint of sarcasm in his voice, he said, "Oh no, Professor?" Then he smirked at Crabbe and Goyle and led them up the steps into the castle. Hermione prodded Ron in the back to make him hurry, and the three of them joined the crowd swarming up the steps through the giant oak front doors and into the cavernous entrance hall, which was lit with flaming torches and housed a magnificent marble staircase which led to the upper floors. The door into the great hall stood open at the right. Harry followed the crowd towards it, but had barely glimpsed the enchanted ceiling, which was black and cloudy tonight, when a voice called, "Potter! Granger! I want to see you!" Harry and Hermione turned around, surprised. Professor McGonagall, Transfiguration teacher and head of Gryffindor House, was calling over the heads of the crowd. She was a stern-looking witch who wore her hair in a tight bun. Her sharp eyes were framed with square spectacles. Harry fought his way over to her with a feeling of foreboding. Professor McGonagall had a way of making him feel he must have done something wrong. "There's no need to look so worried. I just want a word in my office," she told them. "Move along there, Weasley." Ron stared as Professor McGonagall ushered Harry and Hermione away from the chattering crowd. They accompanied her across the entrance hall, up the marble staircase, and along a corridor. Once they were in her office, a small room with a large welcoming fire, Professor McGonagall motioned Harry and Hermione to sit down. She settled herself behind her desk and said abruptly, "Professor Lupin sent an owl ahead to say that you were taken ill on the train, Potter." Before Harry could reply, there was a soft knock on the door, and Madame Pomfrey, the matron, came bustling in. Harry felt himself going red in the face. It was bad enough that he'd passed out, or whatever he'd done, without everyone making a fuss about it. "I'm fine," he said. "I don't need anything." "Oh, it's you, is it?" said Madame Pomfrey, ignoring this and bending down to stare closely at him. "I suppose you've been doing something dangerous again." "It was a Dementor, Poppy," said Professor McGonagall. They exchanged a dark look, and Madame Pomfrey clucked disapprovingly. "Setting Dementors around the school," she muttered, pushing Harry's hair back and feeling his forehead. "He won't be the first one to collapse. Yes, he's all clammy. Terrible things they are, and the effect they have on people who are already delicate." "I'm not delicate," said Harry crossly. "Of course you're not," said Madame Pomfrey absent-mindedly, now taking his pulse. "What does he need?" said Professor McGonagall crisply. "Bed rest? Should he perhaps spend tonight in the hospital wing?" Oh. See? Boars. Pillars. With wild boars. Winged boars. Winged wild boars. That's fun. You know that saying, when pigs fly? Pigs flew. "I'm fine," said Harry, jumping up. The idea of what Draco Malfoy would say if he had to go to the hospital wing was torture. Well, he should have some chocolate at the very least, said Madame Pomfrey, who was now trying to peer into Harry's eyes. I've already had some, said Harry. Professor Lupin gave me some. He gave it to all of us. Did he now? said Madame Pomfrey approvingly. So we finally got a Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher who knows his remedies. Are you sure you're feeling all right, Potter? said Professor McGonagall sharply. Yes, said Harry. Very well. Kindly wait outside while I have a quick word with Miss Granger about her timetable, and then we'll go down to the feast together. Harry went back into the corridor with Madame Pomfrey, who left for the hospital wing, muttering to herself. He only had to wait a few minutes, and then Hermione emerged looking very happy about something, followed by Professor McGonagall, and the three of them made their way back down the marble staircase to the great hall. It was a sea of pointed black hats. Each of the long house tables were lined with students, their faces gleaming by the light of 1,000 candles, which were floating over the tables in mid-air. Professor Flitwick, who was a tiny little wizard with a shock of white hair, was carrying an ancient hat and a 3-legged stool out of the hall. Oh, said Hermione softly, we've missed the sorting. New students at Hogwarts were sorted into houses by trying on the sorting hat, which shouted out the house they were best suited to: Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, or Slytherin. Professor McGonagall strode off to her empty seat at the staff table, and Harry and Hermione set off to the other direction, as quietly as possible, towards the Gryffindor table. People looked around at them as they passed along the back of the hall, and a few of them pointed at Harry. Had the story of him collapsing in front of the Dementor traveled that fast? He and Hermione sat down on either side of Ron, who had saved them seats. What was that all about? He muttered to Harry. Harry started to explain in a whisper, but at that moment the headmaster stood up to speak, and he broke off. Professor Dumbledore, though very old, always gave the impression of great energy. He had several feet of long silver hair. I hope I'm like that when I'm old. Several feet. I already have feet. And a beard, half-moon spectacles, and an extremely crooked nose. He was often described as the greatest wizard of the age, but that wasn't why Harry respected him. You couldn't help trusting Albus Dumbledore, and as Harry watched him beaming around at the students, he felt calm for the first time since the Dementor had entered the train compartment. Welcome, said Dumbledore, the candlelight shimmering on his beard. Welcome to another year at Hogwarts. I have a few things to say to you all, and as one of them is very serious, I think it best to get it out of the way before you become befuddled by our excellent feast. Dumbledore cleared his throat and continued. As you will be aware, after their search of the Hogwarts Express, our school is presently playing host to some of the Dementors of Azkaban, who are here on the Ministry of Magic business. He paused, and Harry remembered that what Mr. Weasley had said about Dumbledore not being happy with the Dementors guarding the school. They are stationed at every entrance to the grounds, Dumbledore continued. And while they are with us, I must make it plain that nobody is to leave the school without permission. Dementors are not to be fooled by tricks or disguises, or even invisibility cloaks, he added blandly, and Harry and Ron glanced at each other. It is not in the nature of a Dementor to understand pleading or excuses. I therefore warn each and every one of you to give them no reason to harm you. I look to the prefects and our new head boy and girl to make sure that no student runs afoul of the Dementors. Percy, who was sitting a few seats along from Harry, puffed out his chest again and stared around impressively. Dumbledore paused again. He looked very serious around the hall, and nobody moved or made a sound. On a happier note, he continued, I am pleased to welcome 2 new teachers to our ranks this year. Firstly, Professor Lupin, who has kindly consented to fill the post of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. There was some scattered, rather unenthusiastic applause. Only those who had been in the compartment on the train with Professor Lupin clapped. Harry among them. Professor Lupin looked particularly shabby next to all the other teachers in their best robes. "Look at Snape," Ron hissed in Harry's ear. Professor Snape, the potions master, was staring along the staff table at Professor Lupin. It was common knowledge that Snape wanted the Defense Against the Dark Arts job, but even Harry, who hated Snape, was startled at the expression twisting his thin, sallow face. It was beyond anger. It was loathing. Harry knew that expression only too well. It was the look Snape wore every time he set eyes on Harry. "As to our second new appointment," Dumbledore continued, as the lukewarm applause for Professor Lupin died away. "Well, I am sorry to tell you that Professor Kettleburn, our Care of Magical Creatures teacher, retired at the end of last year in order to enjoy more time with his remaining limbs. However, I am delighted to say that his place will be filled by none other than Rubeus Hagrid, who has agreed to take on this teaching job in addition to his gamekeeping duties." Harry, Ron, and Hermione stared at each other, stunned. Then they joined in the applause, which was tumultuous at the Gryffindor table in particular. Harry leaned forward to see Hagrid, who was ruby red in the face and staring down in his enormous hands, his wide grin hidden in the tangle of his black beard. "We should have known," Ron roared, pounding the table. "Who else would have sent us a biting book?" Harry, Ron, and Hermione were the last to stop clapping, and as Professor Dumbledore started speaking again, they saw that Hagrid was wiping his eyes on the tablecloth. "Well, I think that's everything of importance," said Dumbledore. "Let the feast begin!" The golden plates and goblets before them suddenly filled with food and drink. Harry, suddenly ravenous, helped himself to everything he could reach and began to eat. It was a delicious feast. The hall echoed with talk and laughter and the clatters of knives and forks. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, however, were eager for it to finish so that they could talk to Hagrid. They knew how much being a teacher would mean to him. Hagrid wasn't a fully qualified wizard. He had been expelled from Hogwarts in his 3rd year for a crime he had not committed. It had been Harry, Ron, and Hermione who had cleared Hagrid's name last year. At long last, when the last morsels of pumpkin tart had melted from the golden platters, Dumbledore gave the word that it was time for them all to go to bed, and they got their chance. "Congratulations, Hagrid!" Hermione squealed as they reached the teacher's table. "All down to you 3, said Hagrid, wiping his shining face on his napkin as he looked up at them. "Can't believe it. Great man, Dumbledore. Came straight down to me hut after Professor Kettleburn said he'd had enough. It's what I always wanted." Overcome with emotion, he buried his face in his napkin, and Professor McGonagall shooed them away. Harry, Ron, and Hermione joined the Gryffindors streaming up the marble staircase, and very tired now, along more corridors, up more and more stairs to the hidden entrance to the Gryffindor Tower. A large portrait of a fat lady in a pink dress asked them, "Password?" Coming through, Percy called from behind the crowd. "The new password's Fortuna Major." "Oh no," said Neville Longbottom sadly. He always had trouble remembering the passwords. Through the portrait hole and across the common room, the girls and boys divided toward their separate staircases. Harry climbed the spiral staircase with no thought in his head except how he was glad to be back. They reached their familiar circular dormitories with its 5 four-poster beds, and Harry looked around, felt he was home at last. I want a bed like that. We're going to start on the next chapter, but I need something to drink. I would love to have an old 4-poster bed with the curtains to draw around it. Jesus. The next chapter is actually pretty long. Angie, do you want me to read it? It's 6:51. Does Manny want to stay up for another half an hour? Sorry, guys, waiting for a response. I lost a viewer. Sorry, guys. Should I take that as a yes? We're going to read the next chapter? Angie, what's up? Make you all stare into my pretty green eyes. Okay. Chapter 6, Talons and Tea Leaves. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione entered the Great Hall for breakfast the next day, the first thing they saw was Draco Malfoy, who seemed to be entertaining a large group of Slytherins with a very funny story. As they passed, Malfoy did a ridiculous impression of a swooning fit, and there was a roar of laughter. "Ignore him," said Hermione, who was right behind Harry. "Just ignore him. It's not worth it." "Hey, Potter!" shrieked Pansy Parkinson, a Slytherin girl with a face like a pug. "Potter! The Dementors are coming, Potter! Woo!" Harry dropped into a seat at the Gryffindor table, next to George Weasley. "New third-year timetables," said George, passing them over. "What's up with you, Harry?" "Malfoy," said Ron, sitting down on George's other side and glaring over at the Slytherin table. George looked up in time to see Malfoy pretending to faint with terror again. "That little git," he said calmly. "He wasn't so cocky last night when the Dementors went down our end of the train. Came running into our compartment, didn't he, Fred?" "Nearly wet himself," said Fred with a contemptuous glance at Malfoy. "I wasn't too happy myself," said George. "They're horrible things, those Dementors." "They sort of freeze your insides, don't they?" said Fred. "You didn't pass out, though, did you?" said Harry in a low voice. "Forget it, Harry," said George bracingly. "Dad had to go out to Azkaban one time. Remember, Fred? He said it was the worst place he'd ever been. He came back all weak and shaking. They suck the happiness out of that place, Dementors. Most of the prisoners go mad in there. Anyway, we'll see how happy Malfoy looks after our first Quidditch match," said Fred. "Gryffindor versus Slytherin. First game of the season, remember?" The only time Harry and Malfoy had faced each other in a Quidditch match, Malfoy had definitely come off worse. Feeling slightly more cheerful, Harry helped himself to a sausage and fried tomatoes. Food sounds good. Hermione was examining her new timetable. "Oh, good! We're starting some new subjects today," she said happily. "Hermione," said Ron, frowning as he looked over her shoulder. "They've messed up your timetable. Look, they've got you down for about 10 subjects a day. There isn't enough time." "I'll manage. I fixed it all with Professor McGonagall." "But look," said Ron, laughing. "See this morning? 9 o'clock, divination. And underneath, 9 o'clock, Muggle studies. And..." Ron leaned closer to the timetable, disbelieving. "Look! Underneath that! Arithmancy, 9 o'clock! I mean, I know you're good, Hermione, but no one's that good. How are you supposed to be in 3 classes at once?" "Oh, don't be silly," said Hermione shortly. "Of course I won't be in 3 classes at once." "Well, then, pass the marmalade," said Hermione. "But, oh, Ron, what's it to you if my timetable's a bit full?" Hermione snapped. "I told you, I've fixed it all with Professor McGonagall." Just then Hagrid entered the great hall. He was wearing his long moleskin overcoat and was absent-mindedly swinging a dead polecat from one enormous hand. "All right," he said eagerly, pausing on the way to the staff table. "You're in my first ever lesson, right after lunch. Been up since 5, getting everything ready. Hope it's okay, me a teacher, honestly." He grinned broadly at them and headed off to the staff table, still swinging the polecat. "I wonder what he's been getting ready," said Ron, a note of anxiety in his voice. The hall was starting to empty as people headed off towards their first lesson. Ron checked his timetable. "We better go. Look, divination's at the top of the North Tower. It'll take us 10 minutes to get there." They finished their breakfast hastily, said goodbye to friend George, and walked back through the hall. As they passed the Slytherin table, Malfoy did yet another impression of a fainting fit. The shouts of laughter followed Harry into the entrance hall. The journey through the castle to North Tower was a long one. 2 years at Hogwarts hadn't taught them everything about the castle, and they had never been inside the North Tower before. "There's got to be a shortcut," Ron panted as they climbed their 7th long staircase and emerged on an unfamiliar landing where there was nothing but a large painting of a bare stretch of grass hanging on the stone wall. "I think it's this way," said Hermione, peering down the empty passage to the right. "Can't be," said Ron. "That's south. Look, you can see a bit of the lake out the window." Harry was watching the painting. A fat, dappled grey pony had just ambled onto the grass and was grazing nonchalantly. Harry was used to the subjects of Hogwarts paintings moving around and leaving their frames to visit each other, but he always enjoyed watching them. A moment later, a short, squat knight in a suit of armor had clanked into the picture after his pony. By the look on the grass stains of his metal knees, he had just fallen off. "Ah!" he yelled, seeing Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "What villains are these that trespass upon my private lands? Come to scorn at my fall, perchance? Draw, you knaves, you dogs!" They watched in astonishment as the little knight tugged his sword out of the scabbard and began brandishing it violently, hopping up and down in rage. But the sword was far too long for him. A particularly wild swing made him overbalanced, and he landed face down in the grass. "Are you all right?" said Harry, moving closer to the picture. "Get back, you scurvy braggart! Back, you rogue!" The knight seized his sword again and used it to push himself back up, but the blade sunk deeply into the grass, and though he pulled with all his might, he couldn't get it out again. Finally, he had to flop back down onto the grass and push his visor up to mop his sweating face. "Listen," said Harry, taking advantage of the knight's exhaustion. "We're looking for the North Tower. You don't know the way, do you?" "A quest!" The knight's rage seemed to vanish instantly. He clanked to his feet and shouted, "Come follow me, dear friends, and we shall find our goal, or else shall perish bravely in the charge." He gave the sword another fruitless tug, tried and failed to mount the fat pony, and cried, "On foot then, good sirs and gentle lady! On! And he ran, clanking loudly, into the left-handed side of the frame and out of sight. Damn it! I should have done his voice like something from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. They hurried after him along the corridor, following the sound of his armor. Every now and then they spotted him running through the picture ahead. "Be of stout heart, the worst is yet to come," yelled the knight, as they saw him reappear in front of an alarmed group of women in crinolines, whose picture hung on the wall of a narrow spiral staircase. Puffing loudly, Harry, Ron, and Hermione climbed the tightly spiraled staircase, getting dizzier and dizzier, until at last they heard the murmur of voices above them, and knew they had reached the classroom. "Farewell!" cried the knight, popping his head into a painting of some sinister-looking monks. "Farewell, my comrades in arms! If ever you've need of a noble heart and a steely sinew, call upon Sir Cadogan." "Yeah, we'll call you," muttered Ron as the knight disappeared, "if we ever need someone mental." They climbed the last few steps and emerged onto a tiny landing where most of the class had already assembled. There were no doors off this landing. Harry Ron nudged Harry and pointed to the ceiling. There was a circular trapdoor with a brass plaque on it. Sybil Trelawney, divination teacher, Harry read. How are we supposed to get up there? As though in answer to his question, the trapdoor suddenly opened and a silvery ladder descended right at Harry's feet. Everyone went quiet. After you, said Ron, grinning, so Harry climbed the ladder first. He emerged into the strangest-looking classroom he had ever seen. In fact, it didn't look like a classroom at all. More like a cross between someone's attic and an old-fashioned tea shop. At least 20 small circular tables were crammed inside it, all surrounded by chintzy armchairs and fat little poofs. Everything was lit with a dim crimson light, and the curtains on the windows were all closed, and the lamps were draped with dark red scarves. It was stiflingly warm, and the fire, which was burning under the crowded mantelpiece, was giving off a heavy, sickly sort of perfume as it heated a large copper kettle. The shelves running around the circular walls were crammed with dusty-looking feathers, stubs of candles, many packs of tattered playing cards, countless silvery crystal balls, and a huge array of teacups. Ron appeared at Harry's shoulder as the class assembled around them, all taking it in whispers. "Where is she?" Ron said. A voice came suddenly out of the shadows, a soft, misty sort of voice. "Welcome," it said. "How nice to see you in the physical world at last." Harry's immediate impression was of a large, glittering insect. Professor Trelawney moved into the firelight, and they saw that she was very thin. Her large glasses magnified her eyes to several times their natural size, and she was draped in a gauzy spangled shawl. Innumerable chains and beads hung round her spindly neck, and her arms and hands were encrusted with bangles and rings. "Sit, my children, sit," she said, and they all climbed awkwardly into armchairs or sank into poufs. Poufs? Pouffes. Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat themselves round the same small table. "Welcome to divination," said Professor Trelawney, who had seated herself in a winged armchair in front of the fire. "My name is Professor Trelawney. You may not have seen me before. I find that descending too often into the hustle and bustle of the main school clouds my inner eye." Nobody said anything in answer to this extraordinary pronouncement. Professor Trelawney delicately rearranged her shawl and continued. "So, you have chosen to study divination, the most difficult of all magical arts. I must warn you on the onset that if you do not have the sight, there is very little I will be able to teach you. Books can take you only so far in this field." At these words, both Harry and Ron glanced, grinning, at Hermione, who looked startled at the news that books wouldn't be much help on this subject. "Many witches and wizards, talented though they are in the areas of loud bangs and smells and sudden disappearings, are yet unable to penetrate the veiled mysteries of the future," said Professor Trelawney went on, her enormous gleaming eyes moving from face to nervous face. "It is a gift granted to few. You, boy," she said suddenly to Neville, who almost toppled off his poof, "is your grandmother very well?" "I think so," said Neville tremendously. "I wouldn't be so sure if I were you, dear," said Professor Trelawney, the firelight glinting off her long emerald earrings. Neville gulped. Professor Trelawney continued placidly. "We will be covering the basic methods of divination this year. The first term will be devoted to reading the tea leaves. Next term we shall progress to palmistry. By the way, my dear," she thought suddenly to Parvati Patel, "beware a red-haired man." Parvati gave a startled look at Ron, who was right behind her, and edged her chair away from him. "In the summer term," Professor Trelawney went on, "we shall progress to the crystal ball, if we have finished with fire omens by then. Unfortunately, the class will be disrupted in February by a nasty bout of flu. I myself will lose my voice, and around Easter one of our number will leave us forever." A very tense silence followed this pronouncement, but Professor Trelawney seemed unaware of it. I wonder, dear, she said to Lavender Brown, who was nearest and shrunk back in her chair, if you could pass me the largest silver teapot. Lavender, looking relieved, stood up, took an enormous teapot from the shelf, and put it down on the table in front of Professor Trelawney. Thank you, my dear. Incidentally, that thing you are dreading, it will happen on Friday the 16th of October. Lavender trembled. Now, I want you all divided into pairs. Collect a teacup from the shelf and come to me and I will fill it. Then sit down and drink. Drink until only the dregs remain. Swill those around in the cup 3 times with the left hand, and then turn upside down on its saucer. Wait for the last of the tea to drain away, and then you give your cup to your partner to read. You will interpret the patterns using the first 5 and using pages 5 and 6 of Unfogging the Future. I shall move among you, helping and instructing. Oh, and dear, she caught Neville by the arm as he made to stand up. After you've broken your first cup, would you be so kind as to select one of the blue patterned ones? I'm rather attached to the pink. Sure enough, Neville had no sooner reached for the shelf of teacups than there was a tinkle of breaking china. Professor Trelawney swept over to him, holding a dustpan and brush, and said, One of the blue ones, then, dear, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. When Harry and Ron had their teacups filled, they went back to their table and tried to drink the scalding tea quickly. They swilled the dregs around as Professor Trelawney had instructed, and then drained the cups and swapped them. Right, said Ron, as they both opened their books to page 5 and 6. What can you see in mine? A load of soggy brown stuff, said Harry. A heavy perfumed smoke in the room was making him feel sleepy and stupid. Broaden your minds, my dears, and allow your eyes to see past the mundane, Professor Trelawney cried through the gloom. Harry tried to pull himself together. Right, so you've got a wonky sort of cross, he said, consulting Unfogging the Future. That means you're going to have trials and suffering. Sorry about that. But there's a thing that could be the sun. Hang on, that means great happiness. So, you're going to suffer, but be very happy about it. You need your inner eye testing, if you ask me, said Ron, and they both had to stifle their laughs as Professor Trelawney gazed in their direction. My turn. Ron peered into Harry's teacup, his forehead wrinkled with effort. There's a blob bit like a bowler hat, he said. Maybe you're going to work for the Ministry of Magic. He turned the teacup the other way. But this way it looks more like an acorn. What's that? He scanned copy of Unfogging the Future. A windfall. An unexpected gold. Excellent. You can lend me some. Professor Trelawney. Honestly, she's one of my more favorite characters as well because she's just so odd. She kind of reminds me of me. Don't be afraid to be yourself. Never be afraid to be yourself. If you want to wear scarves and weird hats and whatever, you know what? Do it. I wear strange clothes all the time. People talk to me, even when I don't want them to. All right. And there's a thing here, he turned the cup again, that looks like an animal. Yeah, if that was its head, it looks like a hippo. No, a sheep. Professor Trelawney whirled around as Harry let out a snort of laughter. Let me see that, my dear, she said reprovingly at Ron, sweeping over and snatching Harry's cup from him. Everybody went quiet to watch. Professor Trelawney was staring at the teacup, rotating it anti-clockwise. The falcon, my dear. You have a deadly enemy. But everyone knows that, said Hermione in a loud whisper. Professor Trelawney stared at her. Well, they do, said Hermione. Everybody knows about Harry and you know who. Harry and Ron stared at her with a mixture of amazement and admiration. They had never heard Hermione speak to a teacher like that before. Professor Trelawney chose not to reply. She lowered her huge eyes to Harry's cup again and continued to turn it. The club. An attack. Dear, dear, this is not a happy cup. I thought was a bowler hat, said Ron sheepishly. The skull. Danger in your path, my dear. Everyone was staring transfixed at Professor Trelawney, who gave the cup a final turn, gasped, and then screamed. There was a tinkle of breaking china. Neville had smashed his cup. Professor Trelawney sank into a vacant armchair, her glittering hand on her heart and her eyes closed. My dear boy, my dear, dear boy. No, it is kinder not to say. No, don't ask me. What is it, Professor? Said Dean Thomas at once. Everyone had got to their feet, and slowly they crowded around Harry and Ron's table, pressing close to Professor Trelawney's chair to get a good look at Harry's cup. My dear, said Professor Trelawney's huge eyes remained opened dramatically. You have the Grim. The what? Said Harry. He could tell that he wasn't the only one who didn't understand. Dean Thomas shrugged at him, and Lavender Brown looked puzzled. But nearly everybody else clapped their hands to their mouths in horror. The Grim, my dear! The Grim! Cried Professor Trelawney, who looked shocked that Harry didn't understand. The giant, spectral dog that haunts churchyards. Oh, my dear boy, it is the omen, the worst omen, of death. Harry's stomach lurched. That dog on the cover of Death Omens and Flourish and Blots. The dog in the shadows of Magnolia Crescent. Lavender Brown clapped her hands to her mouth, too. Everyone was looking at Harry, everyone except Hermione, who got up and moved around to the back of Professor Trelawney's hair. I don't think it looks like the Grim, she said flatly. Professor Trelawney surveyed Hermione with mounting dislike. You'll forgive me for saying so, my dear, but I perceive very little aura around you. Very little retrospectively to the resonance of the future. Oh, wait. Very little... I said retrospectively. Very little respectivity to the resonance of the future. Seamus Finnegan was tilting his head from side to side. It looks like a Grim if you do this, he said, his eyes almost shut. But if you look more like... It looks more like a donkey from here, he said, leaning to the left. When you've all finished deciding whether I'm going to die or not, said Harry, taking even himself by surprise. Now nobody wanted to look at him. I think we will leave the lesson here for today, said Professor Trelawney in her misty voice. Yes, please pack away your things. Doing her voice is literally making me lightheaded. Silently, the class took their teacups back to Professor Trelawney, packed away their books, and closed their bags. Even Ron was avoiding Harry's eyes. Until we meet again, said Professor Trelawney faintly. Fair fortunes be yours. Oh, and dear, she said, pointing at Neville, you'll be late next time, so mind you work extra hard to catch up. Harry, Ron, and Hermione descended Professor Trelawney's ladder in the winding staircase in silence, and then set off for Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration lesson. It took them so long to find her classroom that, early as they had left divination, they were only just in time. Harry chose a seat right in the back of the room, feeling as though he was sitting in a very bright spotlight. The rest of the class kept shooting furtive glances at him, as though he was about to drop dead at any moment. He hardly heard what Professor McGonagall was telling them about animagic. Animagi? Wizards who could transform at will into animals, and wasn't even watching when she transformed herself in front of their eyes into a tabby cat with spectacle markings around her eyes. Really? What has gone into you all today? Said Professor McGonagall, turning back into herself with a faint pop and staring around at them all. Not that it matters, but that's the first time my transformation's not gotten applause from a class. Everyone's heads turned towards Harry again, but nobody spoke, and then Hermione raised her hand. Please, Professor, we've just had our first divination class, and we were reading tea leaves in... Ah, of course, said Professor McGonagall, suddenly frowning. There's no need to tell me any more, Miss Granger. Tell me, which one of you be dying this year? Everyone stared at her. Me, said Harry finally. I see, said Professor McGonagall, fixing Harry with her beady eyes. Then you should know, Potter, that Sybil Trelawney has predicted the death of one student a year since she arrived at this school. None of them has died yet. Seeing death omens is her favorite way of greeting a new class. If it were not for the fact that I never spoke ill of my colleagues... Professor McGonagall broke off, and they saw that her nostrils had gone white. She went on more calmly. Divination is one of the most imprecise branches of magic. I shall not conceal from you that I have very little patience with it. True seers are very rare, and Professor Trelawney... She stopped again, and then said in a very matter-of-fact tone, You look in excellent health to me, Potter, so you will excuse me if I don't let you off on homework today. I assure you that if you die, you need not hand it in. I need water. Hermione laughed. Harry felt a bit better. It was harder to feel scared of a lump of tea leaves away from the dim red light and befuddling perfume of Professor Trelawney's classroom. Not everyone was convinced, however. Ron still looked worried, and Lavender whispered, But what about Neville's cup? When the Transfiguration class had finished, they joined the crowd thundering toward the Great Hall for lunch. Ron, cheer up, said Hermione, pushing a dish of stew towards him. You heard what Professor McGonagall said. Ron spooned stew onto his plate and picked up his fork, but didn't start. Harry, he said in a low, serious voice, you haven't seen a great black dog anywhere, have you? Yeah, I have, said Harry. I saw one the night I left the Dursleys. Ron let his fork fall with a clatter. Probably a stray, said Hermione calmly. Ron looked at Hermione as though she had gone mad. Hermione, if Harry's seen a Grim, that's bad, he said. My Uncle Bylas saw one, and he died 24 hours later. Coincidence, said Hermione airily, pouring herself some pumpkin juice. You don't know what you're talking about, said Ron, starting to get angry. Grims scare the living daylights out of most wizards. Well, there you are then, said Hermione in a superior tone. They see the Grim and die of fright. The Grim's not an omen, it's the cause of death. And Harry's still with us because he's not stupid enough to see one and think, right, well, I'd better pop off now. Ron mouthed wordlessly at Hermione, who opened her bag and took out her new arithmetic book and propped it open against the juice jug. I think divination seems very woolly, she said, searching for her page. A lot of guesswork, if you ask me. There's nothing woolly about the Grim in that cup, said Ron hotly. You don't seem quite so confident when you were telling Harry it was a sheep, said Hermione coolly. Professor Trelawney said you don't have the right aura. You just don't like being rubbish at something for a change. He had touched a nerve. Hermione slammed her arithmetic book down on the table so hard that bits of meat and carrot flew everywhere. If being good at divination means I have to pretend to see death omens in a lump of tea leaves, I'm not sure I'll be studying it much longer. That lesson was absolute rubbish compared to my arithmetic class. She snatched up her bag and stalked away. Ron frowned at her. What's she talking about? He said to Harry. She hasn't been to an arithmetic class yet. Harry was pleased to get out of the castle after lunch. Yesterday's rain had cleared, the skies were clear, pale grey, and the grass was springy and damp underfoot as they set off for their first ever Care of Magical Creatures class. Ron and Hermione weren't speaking to each other. Harry walked beside them in silence as they went down the sloping lawns to Hagrid's hut on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. It was only when he spotted only two familiar backs ahead of them that he realized they must be having these lessons with the Slytherins. Malfoy was talking animatedly to Crabbe and Goyle, who were chortling. Harry was quite sure he knew what they were talking about. Hagrid was waiting for his class at the door of his hut. He stood in his moleskin overcoat, with Fang the boarhound at his heels, looking impatient to start. "Come on now, get a move on," he called as the class approached. "Got a real treat for you today. Great lesson coming up. Everyone here? Right, follow me." For one nasty moment, Harry thought that Hagrid was going to lead them into the Forbidden Forest. Harry had had enough unpleasant experiences in there to last him a lifetime. However, Hagrid strolled off around the edge of the trees, and 5 minutes later they found themselves outside a kind of paddock. There was nothing in there. "All right, everyone gather round the fence here," he called. "That's it. Make sure you can see. Now, first years, you'll want to open your books. Now, first things, you'll want to open your books." "How?" said a cold, drawling voice of Draco Malfoy. "Huh?" said Hagrid. "How do we open our books?" Malfoy repeated. He took out his copy of the Monster Book of Monsters, which he had bound shut with a length of rope. Other people took out their books too. Some, like Harry, had belted their books shut. Others had crammed them into tight bags or clamped them together with bull clips. Hasn't anyone been able to open their books?" said Hagrid, looking crestfallen. The class shook their heads. "Well, you gotta just stroke 'em," said Hagrid, as though this was the most obvious thing in the world. "Look!" He took Hermione's copy, ripped off the spellotape that bound it. The book tried to bite, but Hagrid ran a giant forefinger down its spine. The book shivered and then fell open and lay quiet in his hand. "Oh, how silly we've all been," Malfoy sneered. "We should have stroked them. Why didn't we guess?" I thought they would be funny," Hagrid said uncertainly to Hermione. "Oh, tremendously funny," said Malfoy. "Real witty, giving us books that try and rip our hands off." "Shut up, Malfoy," said Harry quietly. Hagrid was looking downcast, and Harry wanted Hagrid's first lesson to be a success. "Right then," said Hagrid, who seemed to have lost his thread. So you've got your books, and now you need the magical creature. Yeah, so we'll go get him. Hang on." He strode away from them into the forest and out of sight. "God, this place has gone to the dogs," said Malfoy loudly. "That oaf teaching classes. My father'll have a fit when I tell him." "Shut up, Malfoy," Harry repeated. "Careful, Potter, there's a Dementor behind you." "Woo!" squealed Lavender Brown, pointing the opposite side of the paddock. Trotting towards them were a dozen of the most bizarre creatures Harry had ever seen. They had the bodies, hind legs, and tails of horses, but the front legs, wings, and heads of what seemed to be a giant eagle, with cruel steel-colored beaks and large, brilliantly orange eyes. The talons on their front legs were 1/2 foot long and deadly-looking. Each of their breasts had a thick leather collar. Beasts. I wanted to talk about the breasts of it. Oops. Each of the beasts had a thick leather collar round its neck, which was attached to a long chain, and the end of all of these was held in the vast hands of Hagrid, who came jogging into the paddock beside the creatures. "Get in there!" he roared, shaking the chains and urging the creatures toward the fence where the class stood. Everyone drew back silently as Hagrid reached them and tethered the creatures to the fence. "Hippogriffs!" Hagrid roared happily, waving his hands at them. "Beautiful, ain't they?" Harry could sort of see what Hagrid meant. Once you got over the first shock of seeing something that was half horse, half bird, you seemed to appreciate the hippogriffs' gleaming coats, changing smoothly from feathers to hair, each of them a different color: stormy gray, bronze, a pinkish roan, gleaming chestnut, and inky black. "So," said Hagrid, running his hands together and beaming around, "if you want to come a bit nearer..." No one seemed to want to. Harry, Ron, and Hermione approached the fence cautiously. "Now, first thing you gotta know about hippogriffs is they're proud," said Hagrid. "Easily offended, hippogriffs are. Don't never insult one, 'cause it might be the last thing you do." Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle weren't listening. They were talking in an undertone, and Harry had a nasty feeling they were plotting how best to disrupt the lesson. "You always wait for the hippogriff to be the first to move," Hagrid continued. "It's polite, see? You walk up to him, and you bow, and you wait. If he bows back, you're allowed to touch him. If he doesn't bow, then get away from him sharpish, 'cause them talons hurt." "Right, who wants to go first?" Most of the class backed further away in answer. Even Harry, Ron, and Hermione had misgivings. The hippogriffs were tossing their fierce heads and flexing their wings. They didn't seem to like being tethered like this. "No one?" said Hagrid in a pleading look. "I'll do it," said Harry. There was an intake of breath from behind him, and both Lavender and Parvati whispered, "Oh no, Harry, remember your tea leaves." Harry rolled his eyes and ignored them. He climbed over the paddock fence. "Good man, Harry," roared Hagrid. "Right then, let's see you get on Buckbeak." He untied one of the chains and pulled the grey hippogriff away from his fellows and slipped off his leather collar. The class on the other side of the paddock seemed to be holding their breath. Malfoy's eyes were narrowed maliciously. "Easy now, Harry," said Hagrid quietly. You've got eye contact. Now try not to blink. Hippogriffs don't trust you if you blink too much." Harry's eyes immediately began to water, but he didn't shut them. Buckbeak had turned his great sharp head and was staring at Harry with one fierce orange eye. "That's it," said Hagrid. "That's it, Harry. Now bow." Harry didn't feel much like exposing the back of his neck to Buckbeak. "Oh. Hippogriffs, guys! Hippogriffs!" Beautiful creatures. They're gorgeous. I want a hippogriff. I'll ride it to work every day. But he did as he was told, and he gave a short bow and then looked up. The hippogriff was still staring haughtily at him. It didn't move. "Ah," said Hagrid, sounding worried. "Right. Back away now, Harry. Easy does it." And then, to Harry's enormous surprise, the hippogriff suddenly bent his scaly front knees and sank into what was an unmistakable bow. "Well done, Harry," said Hagrid, ecstatic. "Right, now you can touch him. Pet his beak. Go on." Feeling like a better reward would have been to back away, Harry moved slowly toward the hippogriff and reached out toward him. He petted the beak several times, and the hippogriff closed his eyes lazily as though enjoying it. The class broke into applause, all except for Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle, who were looking deeply disappointed. "Right then, Harry," said Hagrid. "I reckon he might let you ride him." This was more than Harry had bargained for. He was used to a broomstick, but he wasn't sure a hippogriff would be quite the same. "Right, climb up there, just behind the wing joint," said Hagrid, "and mind you don't pull any of his feathers out. He won't like that." Harry put his foot on the top of Buckbeak's wing and hoisted himself onto his back. Buckbeak stood up. Harry wasn't sure where to hold on. Everything in front of him was covered in feathers. "Go on, then," roared Hagrid, slapping the hippogriff's hindquarters. Without warning, 12-foot wings flapped open on either side of Harry. He just had time to seize the hippogriff around the neck before he was soaring upwards. It was nothing like a broomstick, and Harry knew which one he preferred. The hippogriff's wings were beating uncomfortably on either side of him, catching him under his legs and making him feel like he was about to be thrown off. The glossy feathers slipped under his fingers, but he didn't dare get a stronger grip. Instead of the smooth action of his Nimbus 2000, he now felt himself rocking forward and backward as the hindquarters of the hippogriff rose and fell with his wings. Buckbeak flew him once around the paddock and then headed back to the ground. This was the bit Harry had been dreading. He leaned forward on the smooth neck lowered, feeling he would slip off over the beak. And then he felt a heavy thud as the four ill-assorted feet hit the ground, and then managed to hold on and push himself straight again. "Good work, Harry!" roared Hagrid as everyone except Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle cheered. "Okay, who else wants to go?" Emboldened by Harry's success, the rest of the class climbed cautiously into the paddock. Hagrid untied the hippogriffs one by one, and soon people were bowing nervously all over the paddock. Neville ran repeatedly backwards from his, which didn't seem to want to bend its knees. Ron and Hermione practiced on the chestnut while Harry watched. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle had taken over Buckbeak. He had bowed to Malfoy, who was now patting his beak, looking disdainful. This is very easy," Malfoy drawled, loud enough for Harry to hear him. "I knew it must have been if Potter could do it. I bet you're not dangerous at all, are you?" he said to the hippogriff. "Are you, you great ugly brute?" It happened in a flash of steely talons. Malfoy let out a high-pitched scream, and next moment, Hagrid was rustling Buckbeak back into his collar as he strained to get at Malfoy, who lay curled in the grass, blood blooming over his robes. "I'm dying!" Malfoy yelled as the class panicked. "I'm dying! Look at me! It killed me!" "You're not dying," said Hagrid, who had gone very white. "Someone help him! Get him out of here!" Hermione ran to open the gate while Hagrid lifted Malfoy easily. As they passed, Harry saw there was a long, deep gash in Malfoy's arm. Blood splattered the grass, and Hagrid ran with him up the slope toward the castle. Very shaken, the Care of Magical Creatures class followed at a walk. The Slytherins were all shouting about Hagrid. "They should sack him right away," said Pansy Parkinson, who was in tears. "It was Malfoy's fault," shouted Dean Thomas. Crabbe and Goyle flexed their muscles threateningly. They all climbed the stone steps into the deserted entrance hall. "I'm going to go see if he's okay," said Pansy, and they all watched her run up the marble staircase. The Slytherins, still muttering about Hagrid, headed away in the direction of their dungeon common room. Harry, Ron, and Hermione proceeded upstairs to Gryffindor Tower. "Do you think he'll be all right?" said Hermione nervously. "Course he will. Madame Pomfrey can mend cuts in about a second," said Harry, who had had far worse injuries mended magically by the matron. "That was a really bad thing to happen in Hagrid's first class, though, wasn't it?" said Ron, looking worried. "Trust Malfoy to mess things up for him." They were among the first to reach the Great Hall at dinner time, hoping to see Hagrid, but he wasn't there. "They wouldn't sack him, would they?" said Hermione anxiously, not touching her steak and kidney pie. "They better not," said Ron, who wasn't eating either. Harry was watching the Slytherin table. A large group, including Crabbe and Goyle, were huddled together in deep conversation. Harry was sure they were cooking up their own version of how Malfoy had gotten injured. "Well, you can't say it wasn't an interesting first day," said Ron gloomily. They went up to the Gryffindor common room after dinner and tried to do the homework Professor McGonagall had set them, but all three of them kept breaking off and glancing out of the tower window. "There's a light on in Hagrid's window," Harry said suddenly. Ron looked at his watch. "If we hurry, we can go down and see him. It's still quite early." "I dunno," said Hermione slowly, and Harry saw her glance at him. "I'm allowed to walk across the grounds," he said pointedly. "Sirius Black hasn't got past the Dementors yet, has he?" So they put their things away and headed out of the portrait hole, glad not to meet anybody on their way out the front doors, as they weren't entirely sure they were supposed to be out. The grass was still wet and looked almost black in the twilight. When they reached Hagrid's hut, they knocked, and a voice growled, "Come in!" Hagrid was sitting in his shirt sleeves at his scrubbed wooden table. His boarhound Fang had his head on Hagrid's lap. One look told them that Hagrid had been drinking a lot. There was a pewter tankard almost as big as a bucket in front of him. He seemed to be having difficulty in getting them into focus. "'Spect it's a record," he said thickly when he recognized him. "Don't reckon you've ever had a teacher who's only lasted a day before." "You haven't been sacked, Hagrid," gasped Hermione. Not yet, said Hagrid miserably, taking a large gulp of whatever was in the tankard. It's only a matter of time, isn't it, after Malfoy? How is he? Said Ron, as they sat down again. It wasn't serious, was it? Madame Pomfrey fixed him up best she could, said Hagrid dully. But he's saying it's still agony, covered in bandages, moaning. He's faking it, said Harry at once. Madame Pomfrey can mend anything. She regrew my bones last year. Trust Malfoy'll milk it for all it's worth. School governor's been told, of course, said Hagrid miserably. They reckon I started too big. Should have left hippogriffs for later. Done flubberworms or something. Just thought it might be good first lesson. It's all my fault. No, it's all Malfoy's fault, Hagrid, said Hermione earnestly. We're witnesses, said Harry. You said hippogriffs attack if you insult them. It's Malfoy's problem he wasn't listening. We'll tell Dumbledore what really happened. Yeah, don't worry, Hagrid. We'll back you up, said Ron. Tears leaked out of the crinkled corners of Hagrid's beetle-black eyes. He grabbed both Harry and Ron and pulled them into a bone-breaking hug. I think you've had enough to drink, Hagrid, said Hermione firmly. She took the tankard from the table and went outside to empty it. Ugh, maybe she's right, said Hagrid, letting go of Harry and Ron, who both staggered away, rubbing their ribs. Hagrid heaved himself out of his chair and followed Hermione unsteadily outside. They heard a loud splash. What's he doing? Said Harry nervously, as Hermione came back in with an empty tankard. He stuck his head in the water barrel, said Hermione, putting the tankard away. Hagrid came back, his long hair and beard sopping wet, wiping the water out of his eyes. That's better, he said, shaking his head like a dog and drenching them all. Listen, it was good of you to come and see me. Hagrid stopped dead, staring at Harry as though he'd just realized he was here. What do you think you're doing, eh? He roared so suddenly that they jumped a foot in the air. You're not to go wandering round after dark, Harry, and you too, letting him. Hagrid strode over to Harry, grabbed him by the arm, and pulled him out of the door. Come on, said Hagrid angrily. I'm taking you back to school, and don't let me catch you walking around after dark again. I'm not worth that. And that's the end of the chapter. Thank you all for listening. We will read chapters 7 and 8 tomorrow. Have a lovely evening. Thank you all for listening. Angie, I don't know if are you going to call me? I'm going to go eat a taco.